In 1763, Britain stood at the height of its power and on the brink of losing it. The ink had barely dried on the Treaty of Paris when ministers in London began to realise what victory truly cost. The 7 Years' War had ended with triumph so complete it seemed almost divine. French forces were expelled from North America. Spanish Florida now flew the British flag. From Bengal to the Caribbean, the empire's red coat had become the symbol of inevitable conquest. Yet, in the counting houses of the Treasury, a different story emerged. The war had drained Britain's coffers with ruthless efficiency. National debt had doubled. Interest payments alone consumed half the government's annual revenue. The East India Company, that great engine of imperial wealth, teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Credit markets whispered warnings that even Whitehall pretended not to hear. The empire now sprawled across a quarter of the globe, a dominion so vast that sunlight never left its borders. But vastness brought vulnerability. Every new territory demanded garrisons, every garrison demanded pay. Every pound spent raised the question no one wanted to ask: who would foot the bill for this magnificent burden? Parliament looked westward across the Atlantic, where 13 colonies had flourished under benign neglect. For generations, these provinces had governed themselves with minimal interference, their assemblies passing laws, their merchants growing rich on trade, both legal and otherwise. They had contributed men and money to the war effort, though never as much as London demanded. Now, with peace restored, they expected to return to their comfortable autonomy. But Britain saw something different when it gazed at America. It saw subjects who had benefited most from the war, yet paid least for its cost. It saw vast territories in the Ohio Valley, seized from France, that required defense from native tribes who refused to accept their new masters. It saw opportunity, the chance to rationalize an empire, to bring colonial administration into line with metropolitan efficiency. The ministers believed they were being reasonable. The colonists would soon believe otherwise. The seeds of imperial overreach were sown at the precise moment of victory, buried in the assumption that power and legitimacy were the same thing. The map of British North America had been redrawn with glorious ambition. New France was now New Britain. The territories stretched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River, from Hudson Bay to the Florida Keys. On paper, it represented the greatest land empire since Rome. In practice, it represented a logistical nightmare that no amount of military genius could solve. The conquered territories came with populations who had no desire to be British subjects. French Catholics in Quebec clung to their language and laws. Native American confederacies, having just lost their French allies, viewed British expansion with undisguised hostility. In 1763, Pontiac's War erupted across the frontier as tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast united in resistance. Forts fell, settlements burned, the cost of pacification mounted daily. Parliament responded with the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line along the Appalachian Mountains beyond which colonial settlement was forbidden. The intent was practical: reduce conflict with native tribes, lower military costs, maintain control over westward expansion. The effect was inflammatory. Colonists who had fought in the war specifically to claim western lands now found their king forbidding them from reaping their reward. Meanwhile, the military establishment required to defend these territories consumed resources at an alarming rate. 10,000 regular troops garrisoned North America, each soldier costing the Treasury dearly. Officers expected their postings to be profitable, supplementing modest pay with the various opportunities that came with authority over frontier trade and land speculation. The system bred resentment on all sides. The colonies, once profitable ventures returning steady revenue through trade regulations and customs duties, had become net drains on imperial resources. The calculation seemed simple to ministers in London. Those who benefited most from protection should bear the cost of their defence. The logic was impeccable. The politics were catastrophic. For generations, the colonies had operated under what Edmund Burke would later call salutary neglect, a system where imperial oversight remained light enough that colonists barely felt its weight. They had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs, taxing themselves through their own assemblies, developing their own sense of political identity. The war had temporarily united them with the mother country in common cause. Peace would reveal just how divergent their interests had become. The Stamp Act of 1765 seemed, to its architects, the very model of reasonable taxation. Unlike external duties on trade, which colonists had long accepted, this was a direct internal tax requiring printed documents, newspapers, playing cards, even dice to bear an embossed revenue stamp. The rates were modest. The purpose was clear: raise roughly £60,000 annually to offset military costs in America. Prime Minister George Grenville had crafted the legislation with care, consulting with colonial agents in London, giving the colonies a year's notice to propose alternatives. None came. Parliamentary debate was perfunctory. The Act passed with barely a dissenting voice. Members assumed that subjects across the Atlantic shared their view that the Empire's children should contribute to the family's expenses. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. The Stamp Act violated a principle that colonists held sacred, even if they had never needed to articulate it before: that Englishmen could only be taxed by representatives they had elected. The colonial assemblies had always held the power of the purse. Now Parliament claimed the authority to reach directly into colonial pockets, without their consent. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. In Virginia, Patrick Henry introduced resolves, declaring that only the colonial assembly could tax Virginians. In Massachusetts, James Otis published pamphlets, arguing that taxation without representation violated the fundamental rights of Englishmen. From Boston to Charleston, the cry went up: if Parliament could impose one tax without consent, it could impose any tax, reducing Americans to the status of slaves. London interpreted the colonial position as absurd. Virtual representation, the theory went, meant that all British subjects were represented in Parliament, regardless of whether they personally voted for members. Most Britons could not vote either. Were Manchester's merchants or Birmingham's manufacturers any less represented than Bostonians? The colonists, Parliament believed, were simply being childish about paying their fair share. But Americans saw something different. They saw a constitutional crisis. They saw the difference between taxes imposed by their own assemblies, which they could influence and control, and taxes imposed by a distant Parliament, where they had no voice and no recourse. The miscommunication was not about money. It was about power, sovereignty, and the fundamental nature of the empire itself. The conversation that should have happened never did. Instead, both sides talked past each other, each convinced of their own righteousness, neither understanding that they were speaking different political languages. The Sons of Liberty emerged from the taverns and printing shops of colonial cities like a shadow government of the streets. They were merchants and artisans, lawyers and labourers, united by the conviction that the Stamp Act represented tyranny in its purest form. Their methods ranged from persuasive to terrifying, and the line between popular protest and mob violence blurred with alarming speed. In Boston, stamp distributor Andrew Oliver was hanged in effigy from the Liberty Tree, then had his office demolished and his home ransacked. He resigned. In New York, Lieutenant Governor Cadwallader Colden had his carriage burned. Across the colonies, every appointed stamp distributor faced similar treatment. By the time the Act was scheduled to take effect in November 1765, there was no one left willing to distribute the stamps, and no stamps left undestroyed. The resistance was not merely violent. Colonial assemblies coordinated their response with unprecedented unity. The Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, bringing together representatives from 9 colonies to draft a declaration of rights and grievances. Merchants organized non-importation agreements, pledging to boycott British goods until the Act was repealed. The boycott worked. British manufacturers, facing the sudden loss of their American market, flooded Parliament with petitions demanding repeal. Parliament faced an impossible choice. Backing down would set a precedent that colonial mobs could dictate imperial policy. Standing firm would require military force to collect taxes that cost more to enforce than they could possibly raise. Economic pressure from British merchants tipped the balance. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act to thunderous celebration in both London and America. But Parliament could not simply admit mistake. On the same day it repealed the Stamp Act, it passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This was the fatal compromise, giving Americans what they wanted in practice while denying them what they claimed in principle. The colonists celebrated repeal and ignored the Declaration. Parliament believed it had preserved its authority. Both sides learned precisely the wrong lesson. Americans learned that resistance worked, that unity and economic pressure could force the empire to retreat. Parliament learned that it could maintain its theoretical supremacy while avoiding practical confrontation. Neither side understood that they had not resolved their dispute but merely postponed it. The fundamental question whether Parliament could tax the colonies without their consent remained unanswered, waiting to explode again at the next miscalculation. Charles Townshend became Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1766, with a reputation for brilliance and a habit of making promises he could not keep. He had assured Parliament he could raise revenue in America without provoking the fury that had doomed the Stamp Act. His solution revealed either extraordinary cleverness or extraordinary misunderstanding of colonial objections. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. These were external taxes on trade, not internal taxes like the Stamp Act. Townshend believed the distinction mattered. He had listened when colonists like Benjamin Franklin testified that they objected to internal taxes, but accepted Parliament's right to regulate trade. He had not listened carefully enough to understand that colonists were beginning to reject any taxation imposed without their consent, internal or external. The revenue would fund colonial administration, paying the salaries of governors and judges directly from customs receipts rather than relying on colonial assemblies for appropriations. This was the real purpose, more important than the money itself. By freeing royal officials from financial dependence on colonial legislatures, Townshend aimed to restore imperial control over provinces that had grown dangerously independent. The colonists saw through the scheme immediately. John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania circulated throughout America, arguing that any tax imposed for revenue rather than trade regulation was unconstitutional. The purpose of the duty, not its form, determined its legitimacy. Once again, colonial assemblies coordinated resistance. Once again, merchants organized boycotts. Once again, the empire had united its opponents through its own heavy-handedness. Smuggling, long a casual supplement to legitimate trade, became an act of patriotism. Merchants who had previously evaded customs duties for profit now did so for principle. The line between criminal and hero depended entirely on one's view of Parliament's authority. John Hancock, whose fortune derived partly from evading customs regulations, became a martyr to liberty when his ship Liberty was seized in Boston Harbor. London underestimated how thoroughly it had alienated colonial opinion. The Townshend duties raised roughly £300 annually in revenue, while costing thousands in enforcement and lost trade. The economic calculation was absurd, but the political calculation was worse. Each attempt to assert authority without consent drove the colonies toward a unity they had never known before, forging a common identity through shared grievance against a government that increasingly seemed foreign to them. In October 1768, British troops landed in Boston Harbor with drums beating and bayonets fixed. 2 regiments of regulars marched through the streets to establish order in a city that Parliament had declared to be in a state of near rebellion. The soldiers came not to conquer but to intimidate, to remind colonists that behind the king's laws stood the king's army. The occupation was meant to restore respect for imperial authority. Instead, it created a daily friction that transformed political disagreement into visceral hatred. Soldiers and civilians competed for jobs, argued in taverns, brawled in streets. Off-duty troops supplemented meagre pay by taking work from local labourers, who resented competing against men who symbolised their oppression. Colonial newspapers printed stories of soldiers' misconduct, exaggerating some incidents, inventing others, creating a narrative of military tyranny. The troops themselves were miserable. Quartered among a hostile population, insulted by children, refused service in shops, they endured an occupation more psychologically grueling than open warfare. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among men who were daily reminded that the people they were meant to control despised them. The situation was combustible, requiring only a spark. On March 5, 1770, the spark came. A confrontation between a British sentry and a Boston wigmaker's apprentice escalated into a crowd gathering around the custom house, hurling snowballs, ice, and insults at increasingly nervous soldiers. Captain Thomas Preston arrived with reinforcements to rescue the sentry. The crowd pressed closer, daring the soldiers to fire. Someone shouted something, perhaps an order, perhaps a taunt. Shots rang out. 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. The Boston Massacre, as it would be immediately termed, was less a massacre than a tragic culmination of impossible tensions. Preston and his men were later tried and acquitted, defended by John Adams, who believed that even hated soldiers deserved justice. But facts mattered less than narrative. Paul Revere's engraving of the incident showed disciplined troops firing into a peaceful crowd on an officer's command, an image reproduced throughout the colonies. The troops were withdrawn from Boston to Castle William in the harbour, a tactical retreat that looked like victory for the colonial protesters, but the damage was irreversible. The massacre had proven that the empire would kill its own subjects to maintain order. It had transformed abstract arguments about constitutional rights into blood on cobblestones. 5 deaths became the rallying cry for liberty, proof that British authority rested ultimately on violence rather than consent. The empire had tried to demonstrate strength and revealed only brittleness. The East India Company, that great commercial empire within the British Empire, stood on the edge of collapse in 1773. Mismanagement, corruption, and military expenses in India had left the company drowning in debt and sitting on warehouses full of unsold tea. The company's potential failure threatened to topple the financial architecture of the empire itself. Parliament had no choice but to intervene. The Tea Act was meant as a corporate bailout disguised as a favour to colonists. By allowing the East India Company to sell tea directly in America without paying certain duties, the act would lower tea prices below even smuggled Dutch tea. Colonists would get cheaper tea, the company would offload inventory and stabilise finances, and the Treasury would still collect a small duty. Everyone would benefit. The logic was perfect. The politics were catastrophic. Colonial merchants who made their living importing and selling tea suddenly faced competition from a monopoly backed by Parliament. The small remaining Townshend duty on tea, which most colonists had learned to ignore, suddenly became impossible to overlook. Accepting the cheaper tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax without consent. The principle that had seemed abstract in 1765 now stood in every shop selling tea at suspiciously low prices. The resistance organised with practised efficiency. In port after port, ships carrying East India Company tea were turned away or their cargo left to rot on the docks. But in Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to let the tea ships depart without unloading. The standoff lasted weeks. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbour. The Boston Tea Party shocked Parliament not because of the property destroyed, roughly £10,000 worth, a modest sum, but because of what it represented. This was not a riot born of momentary passion, but a calculated act of organised defiance. These were not desperate poor people, but respectable citizens conducting what they believed to be legitimate political resistance. To Parliament, this looked like anarchy, the breakdown of all social order. Parliament mistook protest for rebellion and responded accordingly. The colonists had destroyed property to defend a principle. The empire would now destroy colonial self-government to defend its authority. Both sides had passed the point where compromise was possible, without one side admitting it had been fundamentally wrong. Neither side was capable of that admission. The tea dissolved in Boston Harbor, but it left a residue of mutual incomprehension that no amount of goodwill could wash away. Parliament's response to the Boston Tea Party was swift, unified, and catastrophically miscalculated. The Coercive Acts of 1774 represented Britain's attempt to isolate Massachusetts, punish Boston, and demonstrate that defiance of imperial authority carried unbearable costs. Instead, the acts achieved the opposite of every intended effect, uniting the colonies in common cause against what they immediately termed the intolerable acts. The Boston Port Act closed the city's harbour until the destroyed tea was paid for, strangling the commercial lifeline of New England's largest port. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter, replacing elected officials with royal appointees and banning town meetings without the governor's permission. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than colonial courts. The Quartering Act authorized housing troops in occupied buildings throughout the colonies. Each act had its own justification. Together, they represented the complete subordination of a colony's self-government to imperial will. Massachusetts, which had always been the most troublesome province, was to be made an example that would cow the others into obedience. Parliament believed it was being firm. The colonies saw tyranny in its undisguised form. The response revealed how thoroughly Parliament had misunderstood colonial politics. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, the Coercive Acts united all 13 colonies in sympathy and fear. If Parliament could revoke Massachusetts' charter, it could revoke any colony's rights. If royal officials could commit crimes with impunity, no colonist was safe from abuse. The threat to one colony became a threat to all. The Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together representatives from 12 colonies to coordinate resistance. This was not a revolutionary body. Most delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but they agreed on a continental association to boycott British goods, on a declaration of rights, on support for Massachusetts. They agreed, in essence, that the colonies must stand together or fall separately. Britain had spent a decade trying to assert control over colonies that had grown too independent. Every attempt to tighten imperial administration had driven the colonies toward greater unity and more explicit claims of rights. The Coercive Acts completed the process. They pushed moderate colonists toward radicalism, gave substance to radical claims that Britain meant to enslave America, and created the organizational infrastructure for collective resistance. In trying to divide and conquer Massachusetts, Parliament had united and mobilized 13 colonies. The Empire had manufactured the revolution it most feared. The great irony of Britain's confrontation with its American colonies was that the Empire was arguing against its own history, denying to colonists the very rights that had made Britain the freest nation in Europe. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had established parliamentary sovereignty and the principle that Englishmen could not be taxed without their consent through elected representatives. These were the foundational myths of British liberty, taught to every schoolchild, celebrated in every patriotic speech. Yet when colonists cited these principles, Parliament responded that they applied only in Britain itself. Americans, though they spoke English, practiced English law, and considered themselves English, somehow stood outside the constitutional protections that defined what it meant to be English. The contradiction was so glaring that even some members of Parliament recognized it. Edmund Burke and William Pitt argued passionately that Britain was betraying its own values in America. They were overwhelmed by colleagues who saw only defiance that required punishment. The Empire had forgotten how it had become an empire. British expansion had succeeded not through sheer military force, though force played its role, but through offering better terms than competitors. British colonies had prospered because they enjoyed more self-government than Spanish or French possessions. British merchants had dominated trade because they operated under more flexible and fair rules than their rivals. The empire's strength had always come from being less oppressive than the alternatives. Now, in trying to bring the colonies under tighter control, Britain was abandoning the very principles that had made those colonies successful. The colonies had flourished under benign neglect precisely because they had enjoyed, in practice, most of the rights of Englishmen. They had elected their assemblies, controlled their taxes, managed their local affairs with minimal interference. They had developed a political culture that was thoroughly English in its assumptions about liberty, property, and representation. When Parliament claimed the authority to tax them without consent, to revoke their charters, to impose troops among them, to try them in distant courts, colonists did not see themselves as rebels inventing new doctrines. They saw themselves as conservatives defending ancient English liberties against innovation and tyranny. They quoted Locke and Blackstone, cited Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. Their arguments were drawn entirely from British constitutional tradition. The tragedy was that both sides believed they were defending the true meaning of the British Constitution. Parliament saw sovereignty as indivisible. Either it had supreme authority, or it had none. Colonists saw liberty as fundamental. Either they possessed the rights of Englishmen, or they were slaves. There was no middle ground between these positions because they were arguing about different things entirely. Parliament was right about its legal powers. The colonists were right about their historical rights. Both were right, and both were wrong, and the empire would tear itself apart over this irresolvable contradiction. The confrontation no one wanted began in darkness on an April morning in 1775. General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, had received orders to seize colonial military supplies rumoured to be stockpiled in Concord. The mission was meant to be surgical quick march, secure the weapons, return before the countryside could mobilise. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Colonial intelligence was better. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the night, warning that the regulars were marching. By the time 700 British troops reached Lexington Green at dawn, 70 colonial militia stood in formation, neither attacking nor dispersing. Captain John Parker later claimed he ordered his men to disperse. British Major John Pitcairn certainly ordered the colonists to lay down their arms. Someone fired a shot. No one ever determined who. The sound of that gunshot echoed around the world. The British volley that followed left 8 colonists dead on the green. The regulars marched on to Concord, where they found and destroyed some supplies, but encountered increasingly organised resistance. At North Bridge, colonial militia fired on British troops, killing 3. The regulars began their retreat to Boston. What followed was a nightmare that haunted British military planning for years. The entire countryside had mobilised. Thousands of militia materialised from farms and villages, not in massed formations but behind stone walls, in trees, shooting from houses. The British column ran a gauntlet of fire for 15 miles, saved from annihilation only by reinforcements meeting them at Lexington. By the time they staggered back into Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties. Neither side had ordered war, but war had begun anyway. The conflict had slipped its leash, moved beyond the control of rational actors pursuing calculated policies. Gage found himself besieged in Boston by a colonial army that spontaneously formed from militia companies across New England. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, faced the reality of armed conflict before any decision for independence had been made. Lexington and Concord transformed abstract constitutional disputes into immediate violence. Colonists who had debated parliamentary sovereignty now debated survival. British officials who had assumed colonials would never actually fight now confronted thousands of armed farmers apparently willing to die for their principles. The shot heard round the world was not fired by order of any commanding officer but by someone British or colonial, panicked or deliberate. Nobody would ever know. It did not matter who fired it. What mattered was that once fired, there was no taking it back. Blood had been shed. Everything that followed became inevitable. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 in a Philadelphia that hummed with contradictory impulses. Delegates arrived to news of Lexington and Concord, of colonial militia besieging Boston, of blood already shed between British troops and American subjects. Yet the overwhelming majority still hoped for reconciliation. still considered themselves loyal subjects protesting royal ministers rather than revolutionaries rejecting royal authority. Congress found itself managing a war it had not declared on behalf of a nation that did not yet exist. It adopted the New England Army surrounding Boston as a continental force, appointing George Washington as commander, not for his military genius, which was unproven, but for his Virginian origins, which might unite northern and southern colonies in common cause. It authorized money, requisitioned supplies, issued commissions, all the apparatus of sovereign government, while insisting it remained subject to the crown. The logic was tortured but necessary. Congress blamed Parliament and the king's ministers, not the king himself, for colonial grievances. George III was being misled by evil counsellors. If only the king understood colonial loyalty, if only he recognized his subjects' legitimate concerns, reconciliation remained possible. It was constitutional fiction, but fiction that let moderates and radicals work together while postponing the unbridgeable question of ultimate allegiance. Congress drafted the Olive Branch Petition in July, professing loyalty and begging the king to intervene against Parliament's oppressive measures. It was sincere. Most delegates genuinely wanted to avoid complete rupture with Britain. It was also futile. By the time the petition reached London, King George had already declared the colonies in rebellion and closed them to all trade. The king refused even to receive the petition. The door to reconciliation, which Congress had tried so desperately to hold open, slammed shut from the other side. Every British response made independence more inevitable, while colonial leadership still resisted calling it by name. When the king hired Hessian mercenaries to fight in America, it signalled that Britain saw this as a foreign war requiring foreign troops. When Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act, declaring all colonial vessels forfeit and colonists outside the king's protection, it essentially declared war, while claiming to suppress rebellion. When royal governors offered freedom to enslaved people who joined British forces, it suggested Britain would destroy colonial society to preserve colonial submission. Each British misstep narrowed the space for compromise. Moderates who had opposed independence in 1775 found their position increasingly untenable by 1776, not because radical arguments had become more persuasive, but because British policy had made reconciliation functionally impossible. Congress had convened hoping to remain within the empire. Britain's response would force it to leave. The revolution was not chosen but compelled, driven more by British inflexibility than American radicalism. The empire was divorcing itself from its colonies while blaming them for seeking separation. King George III was not a tyrant by temperament, but he played one in American history because he could not imagine that resistance to his authority might be legitimate. He was dutiful, pious, devoted to his conception of constitutional monarchy, and utterly convinced that sovereignty was indivisible. To compromise with colonial demands would be to surrender the very essence of kingship. He believed this with the certainty of someone who had never seriously questioned his own authority. The king saw the American crisis through the lens of order versus chaos. Either the crown governed, or mobs did. Either subjects obeyed lawful authority, or civilization collapsed into anarchy. There was no middle ground in his understanding. When he read reports of colonial resistance, he did not see people defending their understanding of English rights. He saw ungrateful subjects manipulated by demagogues, requiring only firmness to restore them to proper obedience. His ministers fed this certainty. They assured him that colonial resistance was limited to a vocal minority, that most Americans remained loyal, that one decisive military campaign would collapse the rebellion. The king believed these assessments because they matched his view of proper order. He could not accept that ordinary people might have genuine grievances with the way they were governed. To accept that would be to question the entire system that had placed him on the throne. George rejected every petition, every appeal to his mediation between Parliament and colonists. The Olive Branch Petition reached London in August 1775. The king refused to receive it, instead issuing a proclamation of rebellion that declared colonists traitors. This was the moment when reconciliation became impossible. Congress had offered the king a path to resolve the crisis within the existing constitutional framework. he chose to cast them as enemies instead. The king's belief in divine right monarchy, softened though it was by British constitutional tradition, collided with a people who had come to believe that legitimate government required consent of the governed. He thought the colonists were challenging God's appointed order. They thought they were defending God-given natural rights. Both wrapped their positions in the language of morality and justice. Neither could see that they were speaking from incompatible understandings of where legitimate authority came from. In the end, George III made independence inevitable, not through cruelty, but through inflexibility. A wiser king might have recognized that empires require pragmatism, that governing distant provinces demanded compromise, that authority maintained by force alone was already lost. But George believed that any compromise would unravel the entire imperial system. He was probably right. The empire he imagined could not have survived conceding to colonial demands. So, instead, it lost the colonies entirely. His refusal to bend ensured that something broke. The revolution succeeded not against tyranny, but against a king who mistook stubbornness for principle and principle for wisdom. Thomas Jefferson did not set out to destroy monarchy when he drafted the Declaration of Independence in June 1776. He meant to explain why reasonable people had reached an unreasonable conclusion that 13 colonies must sever all connection with the most powerful empire on earth. The document was meant for history, a justification for posterity. Instead, it became a death sentence for the very idea of hereditary rule in America. The Declaration's genius lay in its structure. It opened with self-evident truths that any educated person in the Enlightenment world would recognize: that all men were created equal, that they possessed inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments existed to secure these rights and derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were not radical innovations. They were British and European political philosophy, the same ideas that justified the Glorious Revolution and limited parliamentary monarchy. Then came the indictment, 27 grievances against George III, a litany of abuses meant to prove that the king had violated his contract with his subjects, that he had become a tyrant in the classical sense. Some charges were accurate, some were exaggerated, some blamed the king for policies that Parliament had imposed. The factual precision mattered less than the rhetorical effect. By the time a reader finished the list, the conclusion seemed inescapable. This king had forfeited his right to govern these people. The irony was overwhelming. Britain had forged the Enlightenment ideas now turned against it. British philosophers had developed theories of natural rights and social contract. British political tradition had established the principle that governments must respect individual liberty. British education had taught colonists to think critically about power and its abuses. The empire had exported its intellectual ammunition to America, then expressed shock when colonists loaded and fired it. The Declaration transformed a constitutional dispute into a philosophical revolution. The argument was no longer whether Parliament could tax without consent, whether colonial charters could be revoked, whether troops could be quartered among civilians. The argument was about the nature of legitimate government itself. If rights were inherent, and governments derived their authority from consent, then monarchy based on hereditary right became fundamentally illegitimate. Jefferson's words would echo far beyond their immediate purpose. They would inspire revolutions in France, Latin America, and across the colonial world for centuries. But in 1776, they accomplished something more immediate and more devastating to Britain. They reframed the American Rebellion as a war of ideals rather than interests, of principles rather than taxes. Britain could compromise on taxes, could negotiate over representation, could find middle ground on imperial administration. It could not compromise on the premise that governments ruled by consent rather than divine right. The Declaration made reconciliation philosophically impossible. The war would now be fought not just for independence, but for the soul of political legitimacy itself. The British military campaign in America was doomed before the 1st Regiment sailed from England, not by American military prowess, but by British assumptions that bore no relationship to reality. The The generals who planned the war believed they were suppressing a rebellion of disloyal subjects led by radical agitators. They believed that one decisive victory would collapse colonial resistance and restore loyal populations to proper obedience. Every assumption was wrong. Distance alone made the war nearly impossible. Orders from London took 2 months to reach America, by which time circumstances had invariably changed. Generals requesting reinforcements or supplies faced half-year delays before receiving responses. The British Army had to project force across 3,000 miles of ocean into a hostile continent larger than Western Europe, supplying every nail, every horseshoe, every biscuit from home, because local populations would not cooperate. The generals underestimated their enemy with aristocratic contempt. These were farmers and shopkeepers playing at soldier, they believed, who would scatter at the first bayonet charge. Lexington and Concord should have corrected this assessment. Bunker Hill should have driven the lesson home. Colonial militia had inflicted over 1,000 British casualties before finally being dislodged from their position. But each defeat was explained away as anomaly rather than accepted as evidence that Americans would actually fight. The British command was divided against itself in ways that would have been comical if the consequences were not tragic. General William Howe commanded the army in New York, while his brother Admiral Richard Howe commanded the fleet. They had been sent partly to fight, partly to negotiate, and they never quite decided which mission mattered more. General John Burgoyne commanded forces in Canada with his own ideas about strategy. General Henry Clinton commanded garrisons in the South with different ideas still. They undermined each other's campaigns through a combination of rivalry, poor communication, and confusion about objectives. The generals fought the war they had prepared for rather than the war they faced. They sought the decisive battle that would shatter Washington's army and end the rebellion. But Washington, learning from early defeats, refused to risk his army in pitched battles except when circumstances heavily favored him. He traded space for time, retreating rather than defending, preserving his force as the embodiment of American resistance. As long as his army existed, independence remained possible. Logistics defeated Britain more thoroughly than American arms. The army in America required constant supply from Britain: food, ammunition, clothing, equipment. Every item had to cross the Atlantic, survive the voyage, be unloaded, transported inland, distributed to forces scattered across hundreds of miles. Breaking any link in this chain paralyzed operations. Meanwhile, Americans operated near their supply sources, could forage from friendly populations, could replace losses locally. Britain fought with one hand tied behind its back by the simple geography of trying to conquer a continent from across an ocean. The war was lost in the planning, in the arrogance of assumptions, in the fatal gap between the war Britain imagined fighting and the war it actually faced. France watched Britain's American troubles with the barely concealed glee of a vengeful ex-spouse seeing their former partner's new relationship collapse. The humiliation of the 7 Years' War still burned in French memory the loss of Canada, of India, of global prestige to their eternal rival. Now Britain faced rebellion in the colonies it had seized from France. The irony was too perfect. The opportunity was too valuable. France would help America not out of love for liberty but out of hatred for Britain. French aid began unofficially, while both sides maintained the fiction of neutrality, through companies like Rodriguez Hortalez and Company, actually a front for French government funding. Money and supplies flowed to American forces. French military experts offered advice. French ports sheltered American ships. The French foreign minister, Vergennes, orchestrated this aid with careful deniability, helping America just enough to prolong British agony without yet provoking open war. The American victory at Saratoga in October 1777 changed French calculations. Burgoyne's surrender of an entire British army proved that American independence was actually achievable, not merely a colonial fantasy. More importantly, it suggested that Britain might be willing to compromise with the colonies to end the conflict. France had to act before Britain and America reconciled, leaving France isolated and having achieved nothing from British difficulties. The Franco-American alliance of February 1778 was a marriage of desperate convenience. France committed to recognize American independence, provide military support, and fight until that independence was secured. America gained a powerful ally with a navy that could challenge British naval supremacy. Neither side trusted the other. American Republicans despised French monarchy and Catholic autocracy. French aristocrats viewed American democracy as dangerous mob rule, but they shared an enemy, and that was enough. France's entry transformed the war from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Britain now had to defend Jamaica, Gibraltar, India, and home waters against French fleets, dispersing forces that might have crushed the American rebellion. Spain joined France in 1779, the Dutch in 1780. Britain suddenly faced a coalition of European powers, all eager to profit from British distraction in America. The bitter truth was that American independence might have remained impossible without French intervention. Washington's army could survive, could resist, could make British victory expensive, but it probably could not have achieved outright military victory against the full weight of British arms. French money, French supplies, French soldiers, and above all the French Navy provided the margin between American survival and American victory. The infant United States owed its birth not to American virtue but to French vengeance. Liberty, it turned out, was delivered by an absolute monarchy. The revolution succeeded because an empire's oldest rival became the midwife of America's birth, motivated not by love of freedom but by opportunity to wound an ancient enemy. The American Rebellion was never just about 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard. By 1780, the conflict had metastasized into a world war that touched every corner of Britain's global empire and threatened the trade routes that sustained it. What began as a crisis of imperial governance had become a crisis of imperial survival. Britain found itself fighting alone against a coalition that seemed to include every nation with a grudge or an ambition. The Caribbean became a theatre of war as important as North America itself. Sugar islands represented wealth that dwarfed anything mainland colonies produced. British and French fleets maneuvered for control of islands whose value was measured in the thousands of enslaved people working their plantations. An island that changed hands could shift the balance of imperial wealth more than a dozen mainland battles. Admirals who failed to protect Jamaica faced disgrace worse than generals who lost battles in Virginia. India erupted into conflict as French-backed Indian rulers challenged British East India Company dominance. The Mysore Wars pitted Britain against Hyder Ali, who had French military advisors and artillery. The company's forces, already stretched thin governing newly conquered territories, now had to fight to preserve gains from the previous war. Every soldier, every ship, every pound spent in India was unavailable for America. The empire's global ambitions had created global vulnerabilities. Spain besieged Gibraltar, attempting to reclaim the fortress that controlled the Mediterranean's entrance. The rock held, but only through brutal rationing and improvised defences. The siege tied down troops and ships that might have been decisive elsewhere. The Dutch, provoked by British high-handedness toward neutral shipping, found themselves at war with Britain as well. Their entry into the conflict opened another front, threatened more trade routes, stretched British naval resources even thinner. Britain's navy, which had dominated the seas for decades, suddenly faced French and Spanish fleets combined that outnumbered British ships. The Royal Navy could no longer guarantee protection of trade routes, supply of garrisons, or reinforcement of armies. In 1781, French naval superiority in American waters for a few crucial weeks enabled the victory at Yorktown that effectively ended the war. British global supremacy, taken for granted for so long, revealed itself as fragile when challenged simultaneously on multiple fronts. The war demonstrated the fatal flaw in imperial logic. Britain had built an empire so vast that defending it required resources that the empire itself could not generate. Every new territory added to the empire increased both wealth and vulnerability, expanding the perimeter that needed protection. The American Rebellion revealed that Britain lacked the military capacity to suppress a determined colonial revolt while simultaneously defending all other imperial possessions against opportunistic rivals. The empire's global weight had become the empire's global weakness, Britain was learning a lesson that future empires would have to relearn, that size alone does not guarantee security, that overextension creates fragility, and that fighting everywhere means fighting effectively nowhere. Yorktown in October 1781 was not just a military defeat, but a moment of terrible clarity. Lord Cornwallis had marched his army to the Virginia coast, expecting the Royal Navy to evacuate or reinforce him. Instead, a French fleet appeared, cutting off escape by sea while Washington's army and French forces under Rochambeau closed the trap by land. After a brief siege, Cornwallis surrendered over 7,000 troops. The British band supposedly played "The World Turned Upside Down." It was more accurate than metaphor. The defeat was not unprecedented. Burgoyne had lost a larger army at Saratoga 4 years earlier, but Yorktown shattered something deeper than military formations. It destroyed the illusion that had sustained British policy for a decade, that colonial rebellion could be suppressed, that one more campaign might restore proper order, that American resistance was merely waiting for British determination to break it. Cornwallis's surrender proved that Britain could not win this war, not militarily, not politically, not at any cost the nation was willing to pay. News reached London in late November and hit Parliament like a physical blow. Lord North, the Prime Minister who had overseen war policy, reportedly took it as he would have taken a ball in his breast, crying out, "Oh God, it is all over." He was right. The war would technically continue for another year, but everyone understood it was finished. Parliament would soon vote against continuing offensive operations in America. The question was no longer whether to recognize American independence, but only what terms to accept. The awakening was painful for an empire that had conquered Canada, dominated India, defeated France on 3 continents. Britain had possessed overwhelming military force, the world's strongest navy, virtually unlimited resources compared to American poverty. It should have been able to crush 13 disunited colonies led by amateur soldiers. That it failed revealed something more troubling than simple military defeat. It suggested that the entire system of imperial control was fundamentally broken. The empire had operated on the assumption that military force could compel obedience, that sufficient determination could overcome colonial resistance. Yorktown proved otherwise. An empire built on control could not survive on contempt. A government ruling without consent required constant military presence, endless expenditure, and eternal vigilance against rebellion. Even victory would have been defeat. Britain would have needed permanent occupation forces in America, turning colonies from assets into liabilities. The real loss at Yorktown was not soldiers or territory, but confidence in the imperial project itself. Britain had believed it could manage its empire through a combination of military force and administrative efficiency, imposing order from above on colonial subjects who would eventually accept their proper place. America had proven this impossible. A population determined to resist, willing to endure years of war and privation for self-governance, could not be held by force alone. The empire had learned too late that control and consent were not the same thing, that authority flowed from legitimacy rather than power. Britain would have to learn to let go, not from magnanimity but from necessity, not by choice but by the recognition that some costs were too high to bear even for the world's greatest empire. London descended into political chaos as the reality of Yorktown sank in. The carefully maintained fiction that colonial rebellion could be suppressed collapsed, and with it, the ministries that had prosecuted the war. Somebody had to be blamed for this disaster, and everyone had candidates except themselves. The recriminations began before Cornwallis's troops had even been paroled. Lord North's government crumbled. He had never wanted the position in the first place, had tried multiple times to resign, had been kept in office only by the King's refusal to accept his resignation. Now he was blamed for policies that Parliament and the King had both enthusiastically supported. The generals blamed politicians for insufficient support. Politicians blamed generals for military incompetence. Everyone blamed the King's stubbornness, though few dared say so publicly. Parliament turned on its own war policy with the speed of drowning men abandoning a sinking ship. Members who had voted for every military appropriation, every punitive measure against colonies, now claimed they had always harboured doubts. The Rockingham Whigs, who had opposed the war, gained power on a platform of immediate peace. Their triumph was less about vindication of their principles than about Parliament's desperate need to find someone who was not implicated in the disaster. The blame game obscured a more fundamental problem. No one was willing to examine the system that had created them all. Parliament was not wrong that the generals had made mistakes. Howe's hesitations, Burgoyne's arrogance, Clinton's timidity had all contributed to British defeats. But the generals were not wrong that Parliament had given them impossible missions with insufficient resources, and neither generals nor Parliament wanted to confront the reality that King George's inflexibility had closed off every path to compromise. The peace negotiations revealed Britain's reduced circumstances. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay negotiated from strength, backed by French alliance and British exhaustion. Britain had to recognise American independence, evacuate its forces, cede territory south to Florida and west to the Mississippi. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 was generous by the standards of most peace treaties. Britain lost only America, not Caribbean possessions or Canada. But for an empire that had begun the decade astride the world, merely losing 13 colonies felt like catastrophic defeat. The political reckoning was incomplete, because a complete reckoning would have required admitting that the entire imperial system rested on assumptions incompatible with governing people who believed they deserved rights rather than obligations. Easier to blame individuals than systems, to find scapegoats rather than face fundamental flaws. The empire would reform itself, certainly, would learn tactical lessons about military strategy and colonial administration, but it would not confront the basic question America had forced: whether empire built on control over subjects could survive when those subjects demanded to be citizens. Britain's political chaos was not the chaos of change but of refusal to change, not the crisis of transformation but the crisis of denial. The empire would find new ministers, new strategies, new colonies to replace those lost. What it would not find, immediately, was wisdom to understand why it had failed. The loss of America should have destroyed the British Empire. Instead, it transformed it. The lessons learned in the smoking ruins of colonial rebellion would forge what historians would call the Second British Empire, one built less on direct control and more on commercial influence, less on military garrisons, and more on economic integration. Britain was learning, slowly and reluctantly, to let go of direct governance while maintaining indirect power. The change in approach was visible first in Canada, where British North America remained loyal precisely because Britain had not pushed it toward rebellion. The Quebec Act of 1774, which had so inflamed the 13 colonies, had granted French Catholics religious freedom and kept their civil law. Canada would be governed with a lighter touch, local administration respected, no attempt to impose complete uniformity. The lesson seemed to be that leaving colonists alone worked better than micromanaging them. In India, the East India Company transformed from commercial enterprise into colonial government, but one that ruled through existing power structures rather than replacing them entirely. British officials learned to work with local princes to maintain the fiction of traditional authority while exercising real control behind the scenes. It was empire by influence rather than direct administration, more sustainable because it required fewer British troops and administrators to maintain. The new imperial strategy emphasized trade over territory. Britain did not need to govern every port to dominate global commerce. Control of key strategic points, Gibraltar, Cape Town, Singapore, combined with the world's largest merchant fleet and navy, gave Britain economic dominance without the cost of administering vast populations. Informal empire through trade proved more profitable and less troublesome than formal empire through conquest. The shift was pragmatic rather than principled. Britain did not suddenly embrace colonial self-governance from moral conviction, but from recognition that the American model of empire was too expensive to sustain. Allowing colonies more autonomy was cheaper than suppressing rebellion. Building influence through trade was more profitable than maintaining garrisons. The empire was learning not to be better, but to be more efficient, not to be less controlling, but to control through different means. The American Revolution had taught Britain that some subjects would fight rather than submit to direct rule, and that fighting them cost more than letting them govern themselves while maintaining commercial ties. This lesson would shape British imperial policy for the next century. Australia and New Zealand would receive responsible government while remaining in the empire. Britain would eventually grant independence to Canada, to South Africa, to its Caribbean possessions, transforming empire into commonwealth. Not from generosity, but from the hard wisdom purchased by American rebellion that empires built on consent endure longer than empires built on force, that influence maintained through choice outlasts control imposed through coercion. The empire learned to let go because America had proven the cost of holding on. The United States of America exists because Britain could not tolerate colonial autonomy. This is the central irony of the American founding, that the nation most identified with revolution and rebellion was in fact deeply conservative, seeking only to preserve rights it believed it already possessed. Britain's obsession with imperial control created a nation founded on resistance to control. In trying to tighten its grip, the empire forced independence on colonies that had never wanted separation. The colonists who resisted the Stamp Act in 1765 did not imagine themselves as founders of a new nation. They imagined themselves as Englishmen defending English liberties. Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams did not set out to invent American independence, but to preserve colonial self-government. Even the Continental Congress in 1775 hoped for reconciliation. They became revolutionaries only because Britain refused to accept anything less than submission. The greatest gift Britain gave America was not liberty. Americans already believed they were free. It was unity. The 13 colonies had little in common before the imperial crisis. They competed economically, differed culturally, spoke of each other as foreigners. Massachusetts Puritans had nothing obvious in common with Virginia planters, New York merchants despised Philadelphia Quakers, and everyone looked down on Georgia. Britain's ham-fisted attempts to assert control gave them common grievance, common enemy, common cause. British policy forged American identity through opposition. The United States became what Britain once was, restless, ambitious, ungovernable in the best sense. Britain in its earlier centuries had been Europe's troublemaker, defying continental empires, asserting rights against monarchs, building wealth through trade rather than conquest. America inherited these characteristics and amplified them. The commitment to representative government, to individual rights, to skepticism of centralized authority, all derived from British political tradition, now freed from the constraints of British class structure and European entanglements. The accidental founders were men who found themselves making revolution almost despite themselves. Washington wanted only to be a Virginia planter. Adams wanted to practice law. Jefferson wanted to study philosophy. Franklin wanted to tinker with science. They became revolutionaries because Britain forced the choice between submission and separation. They founded a republic because monarchy had failed them. They wrote a constitution, limiting government, because unlimited government had oppressed them. Every distinctive American institution was created in reaction to some British abuse. The final irony is that America's success vindicated the very principles Britain claimed to hold. Britain boasted of rights, liberty, representative government, and then denied those things to colonists. America took Britain's professed values seriously and built a nation on them. The United States became the world's most successful experiment in government by consent, not because Americans invented democracy, but because they were willing to fight for principles Britain taught them, but would not honor. Britain lost an empire and gained a mirror, a reflection of what it claimed to be but refused to become. The empire's obsession with control created a nation that would spend 2.5 centuries learning, sometimes failing, often struggling, but always aspiring to govern with consent rather than force. The American Revolution succeeded because Britain made the revolution inevitable, then wondered why colonists would not simply submit. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.